So, hello and a warm welcome to Timbro and this stop on the Free Market Roadshow. My name is Karin Svanberg-Sjövall. I'm the director of Timbro. Now, it's the first time that we host this event on the Free Market Roadshow, but obviously not the first time that we open up our doors to free market initiatives, to a wider international debate on the importance of entrepreneurship, on fiscal conservatism and the limits of the state. This time, and the first time, again, we've been a bit unlucky, I'm afraid, because even if the winds of freedom transgress borders, the same cannot be said about the majority of the people who were supposed to host the panels. They have been held up in an airport in Spain. So unfortunately, the program is going to be slightly shorter than what we had announced previously. But luckily for us, we do have some very distinguished guests with us here today who was able to make it anyway, so I'm sure they would be more than worthwhile. So with that said, I would like to say thanks to Dr. Barbara Kolm, who's one of the people who were held up in Spain, but who was organizing this event, and to the Austrian Economic Center for inviting us to participate. And wish you all a thought-provoking and interesting afternoon and evening. Thank you. Anders?
I think this will work. Victor, does it work? Okay, my name is Anders Sydstedt, and I'm the chairman of Svensk Tidskrift, who is the local partner for this event for Free Market Roadshow in Stockholm. And I think perhaps most Swedish, all you here perhaps know about Svensk Tidskrift, but if we have some people who will view this on the web, or perhaps viewers from abroad, I will say just a few words about Svensk Tidskrift. It's an online magazine, a center-right magazine, and comes new articles every Friday, and we try to be a bridge between think tanks and people develop on new political ideas and practical politicians doing the work. So ideas from like Timbro and so on, we will try to market them to politicians. And I will be part moderator of this discussion. As Karin said before, there will be a slight change of the program. So this will be a mix of panels and presentations, but I hope it will work. We have 90 minutes, and there will be plenty of time for you to ask questions also and take part of the discussion, but you will have to use a microphone because all this event will be on video and sent on the internet, and you can see it on svensktidskrift.se on Friday if everything works as we said. We will start with a keynote speech of Charlotte Boman. She's an economist, and nowadays an investor, and she has experience from a lot of organizations and companies as a CEO, and she's now the Secretary General of Hand in Hand organization. So the floor is yours, Charlotte.
Thank you. It's nice to get the applauses before you start. That's encouraging. Okay, I'm Charlotte Boman, and I was invited here today to give my views on entrepreneurship, really. My background is that I have a business degree in business administration, and I've been working with companies, with large companies, and with family-owned companies. Actually, one of my family companies for a long time that we sold. Now I work with startups, investing in startups since 10 years, and I also work with a charity organization called Hand in Hand, that I think maybe your Swedes would know about, but maybe not the foreigners. Hand in Hand is a developing organization, an NGO working with entrepreneurship in poor countries like India and Africa. But with this, it's the same concept, really. It's just about startups, starting enterprises, being an entrepreneur. And I just like to start this very brief introduction about, I'm going to talk about two things, really. I'm going to talk a bit about the individual, the entrepreneur himself or herself, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the ecosystem around this entrepreneur. If you start with the entrepreneur, which is, as we all know, a French word, it's somebody doing something. And an entrepreneur, I can tell you, it's much more challenging than you could ever imagine. It's a lot about talking about entrepreneurship nowadays. It was not the case when I was young. then everybody was supposed to work with big companies or in large organizations or with the government. Nowadays, over the last, at least in Sweden, over the last, I'd say, 5, 6, 7 years, entrepreneurship has become a keyword, a word that politicians are using, organizations are using it. It's become a keyword. And if you want to contribute to growth in a society, if you think that's essential, that is important, I think entrepreneurship is the key. Now, not all political parties really want growth, but the ones that want growth would go for entrepreneurship. Then, if you look at the how do you make up an entrepreneur? I think an entrepreneur is, you need a environment that is conducive, that is encouraging, because entrepreneurship is about driving something from the very beginning to the very end. You cannot be idle and lazy, I can tell you. You go up early in the morning, you work late at night, and you have to devote yourself to the idea that you want to pursue. What you want to pursue could be anything really. Nowadays it's a lot about technical stuff, it's internet. We all think we're going to become Spotify or Skype or something. We're not going to become Spotify or Skype. Only few people do. But we can all be entrepreneurs in smaller enterprises and smaller companies. So I think we need to pay equal respect to the small entrepreneurs, which is really the carpenter, the hairdresser, whatever you're going to look for. But the ones that really try to either start up something or develop something or would make a buyout. Because I've actually read somewhere that you got equally or you got even more companies being sustainable would be the buyout, something that you see in a larger company, in the larger circumstances. You can buy it out and you can develop it to something new. What I think is important too is that we do not focus only on technology, on internet. It's all over the place. We have to talk about soft services. We have to look at all the big companies, all these big successes that Sweden had lately. IKEA, which is furniture, is not very technical. Don't tell IKEA that, but medium technical. H&M, which is clothing. EF, which is education, training, language training. Many of those companies are not that technical. And I think, for example, that the idea that in many cases programs would have, state-run programs or regional programs would focus on technical issues is not always the best. I think you should try to let everyone develop. You look at something called the Linas matkasse, for example, or all those bags of food that people carry to your home. That was not invented like 6, 7 years ago. Nobody thought about it. It's not very technical. It's an idea that somebody develops. And that is the individual. And the individual, I think, is encouraged about, one thing is the financial side. Now, everybody's talking about the financial side, about the lack of seed capital, the lack of venture capital. I think this is important, but I do not think that's the most important thing. The most important thing is to be encouraging the environment, the attitude towards entrepreneurs. Is it good or bad to be an entrepreneur? Is it something that you want to develop in society? If you look, for example, at the Swedish society, which is obviously the society I know the best, for example, over the last, I'd say, 3 years, you talk a lot about social entrepreneurs. It's like the Swedish society cannot really focus completely on an entrepreneur, because somewhere on an entrepreneur side, it's something about money or something. But if you talk about a social entrepreneur, you can say you contribute something in a social way to the society. I think an entrepreneur of any kind is a social entrepreneur. Entrepreneurship is always good. Exploitation is not good, but that's a completely different matter. We do not like exploitation of environment or of people or anything, but that's a different thing. But in general, entrepreneurship is a good thing. That is what is driving the society. In Sweden, we have actually quite a good program nowadays in the schools, which you might be familiar with, called Ung företagsamhet. I think it's called Young Entrepreneurship. And that has only been, it's part of the curriculum now in the by the age of 18 to 19, just before you graduate from high school. And it's a program that you can choose, and you get credits for it. And what you really do is you build a small pretended company. You develop a business concept, you issue little bonds, you get a little organization, you have a group of people, you try to develop something. And there's actually a fair normally every year in Stockholm at least, I think in other places as well, where they exhibit the products, and it's quite interesting. And this is a way of trying to get the entrepreneurship idea into people's mind. And I am told, I cannot confirm it, but some research has been done, and apparently the ones that have been through this program would be more likely to start their own enterprises than the others, right? He's nodding, yeah, correct. So it is a good thing, and it's something that if it's not everywhere, that's something we should develop, I think. One thing too about this entrepreneurship that I think we don't always realize, I said that obviously you need financial capital. Now, I personally do not think that's the most difficult part. You need a good team, and I think that is the crucial thing with an entrepreneur. You need a good team, because you cannot run a business by yourself. You don't have enough hours. And that is from my experience, really what is essential. You have to get the right people into that organization. Or to that startup. And it's difficult because normally you start, by one or two people, maybe three people, and you're going to build something with 20, 100 people. That is really the big challenge. And around all this, you need training, which is then for example, what you start with young entrepreneurship, but that will continue through the incubators that there are in Sweden, for example, like Stockholm Innovation and Growth, STING, which is a good one, and some other networks that you can work with, where you really get support in how to handle the day-to-day operation. But again, I can tell you, being an entrepreneur is easy to say, but it's not as easy to run it. Okay, then, so it's a lot about the individual and the attitude and the strength and the motivation of the individuals. And I think more can be done on the training, but I think Sweden is moving in that direction. I think some other countries in Europe would need to do more actually in this field. Secondly, if we talk about the ecosystem around the entrepreneur, it's obvious that you need good education. I mean, to build a company, you need to have a system where good education is provided. And when we're talking about education, again, because when you read nowadays all the papers, all the magazines, all the information you get, it's all about high technology development. This is not always the key, I think. I think we need vocational training. I think we need very niched training on all different matters that we do not know to do and that we're losing. And because everybody is not going to be like, the old Ericsson or Dahlén who invented we're not going to be that way. We have all different things, and that is important, I think. And the more programs you get, the more involvement from the state you get, the more involvement from the European community gets, saying, this is the niche, this is what we're going to do, this is how you're going to develop. I'm not sure it's going to work. I think you should, everybody try instead. Lower the thresholds and let all different activities come out. That is really important. Obviously, I think that regulation is not always beneficial. And if you look at the Swedish society, for example, today, if you look at the education, schools, healthcare, elder care, you are struck by the discussions that is going on, that it's not for profit, and that you want to limit the private initiatives that are in that field. I personally think this is a completely wrong way to go. I think you might need to look into, if it's paid by taxes, obviously you need to look into how it's organized. But already the alternative that something else exists makes a pressure. Like the way we had with the schools some 15 years back, where we have alternative, schools in Sweden used to be all state-owned. They're not anymore. You have different varieties of schools. And I think that's equally important with the healthcare and elder care, that you have alternatives, but just because it exists, that would make a certain pressure on the general movement. So that is an important thing where I think Sweden has, I don't know, we're just hiding in a corner somehow, not wanting to take part of society. I don't know what's happening. Regulations in general then, not only in this field, but in other fields. I'll give you an example that I'm just fascinated about. If you go to two places, you go to the Costa del Sol in Spain, which is a tourist place. You go to French Riviera in France, which is also a tourist place. You got lots of tourists. In Spain, you can get a taxi everywhere, anytime, and it's not too expensive. You walk out the streets, there's a taxi. It's safe, it's okay. Try to get a taxi on the French Riviera, and you're going to be struggling for hours if you're not at the airport. It's interesting. It's because it's licensed in France. It's apparently quite like 100,000, over 100,000 euros to buy a taxi license in France. And it's supposed to be corrupt. That I don't know. This is what I've heard. It's very interesting. And which means that you lose a large number of jobs because people cannot drive the taxis and you can't find a taxi. It doesn't make sense. I've actually personally at one time when I was out in a village in the south of France, and there was an event, was a fête de la musique, was a music event. And I had a friend who wanted to leave. No taxis, restaurant, please call a taxi. Cannot call a taxi, no taxis around. I went up to a policeman and said, please, could you help me with the taxi? Oh, very difficult, okay, I will. So he calls something on the phone. We wait for about 20 minutes, and there is a taxi. And I say, oh, there's a taxi. And he says, no, not that one, not that one. That was an ordinary taxi that was passing by. No. 2 minutes later comes a private car. His friend, of course. That taxi was okay. So even the police guy organized a black taxi for me, just because it's not open competition. So that is the effect of too much regulation. Then obviously you cannot, if you look at the entrepreneurs again, if you look at the system when you run a company or an organization, you cannot avoid mentioning labor laws and the regulation of employing and not employing people. How you go about that, how you handle that. And I think our American friends would be, if they really got into the system that we have in Sweden and in other places in Europe, would be very surprised about the difficulties that you have as an employer to employ people and to choose your co-workers. I've been through that myself, and I can tell you there's nothing that you spend so much time on as on trying to get the right people and trying to get rid of the ones that you don't want without telling them, because you can't tell them up front that you don't contribute. You have to use certain ways. And obviously it holds back when employing, because you are you don't take a chance, you don't risk anything, because you know you're going to get stuck with this person for a long time, and it gets very expensive and it gets very complicated. It's not only the money, it's the system itself, because the time that you spend on checking how to tell somebody that he or she is not wanted, or however you're gonna solve the situation, is huge, really. And I think that's something that Europe really needs to work on to stay competitive, because you come back to this about constructive destruction. This is all, what the market economy is about. It's okay to change things, and it's okay to lose a job, to do something else. But then again, of course, you need to build a system where you certainly make that people get a training that is adequate, that you get new jobs and all that. But that can be handled, but the companies cannot stay with all the risk of employing people, with all the sick leave and everything else. It's very demanding on smaller companies, and also on bigger companies, I can tell you. So that is something also that needs to be addressed, I think. I think that I've talked for about 15 minutes now, have I? So
yeah.
So if you...
But I have... I have a short question. I think you as an entrepreneur, obviously you have thought a lot about regulation and obstacles to entrepreneurship, but as an entrepreneur you always have to look into needs, what the people need, and try to find possibilities, not obstacles. What do you think about the balance as an entrepreneur, to focus to get rid of obstacles or to find possibilities to go around them?
I mean, being an entrepreneur is about, because I mean, again, normally when I think about the business, when I run it, when I've been doing businesses, it's always about the market. It's always about something. You have to get somebody who's willing to pay for the service or the product that you want to move, and that is the key thing. And normally you get down to quality and quantity, the old stuff, and obstacles you just need to. I mean, it's like the political regulations that there are. I mean, you have to work with them. You can't avoid them. It's part of the. You just need to work around them, and you do. But it takes energy out of the energy that you could use for building a business.
Yeah, but obviously you put some energy into talking about regulations and the problems with them and possibilities.
Talking is one thing, but talking is easy, but getting the change is more difficult, obviously. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Now I introduce Maria Eriksson, who is the editor-in-chief for Svensk Tidskrift, and she will take on this panel.
Yeah. Let's come back to the question about entrepreneurship later, but let's now turn to the second part of our main theme today, getting from stagnation to growth in Europe. Since the financial crisis in 2008, most of Europe's economies have not fully recovered and have seen low growth rates. So how do we change this trend of stagnation? What do we need to get growth? And to get a perspective on this question, we have invited two Americans. And let me start by you, Dan Mitchell, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute. Tell us, you have some pictures. I'll try to find your presentation.
I think maybe we hit escape or something.
Yeah, that's true. So.
That one.
That one. Okay, the floor is yours.
Actually, let me start with my one story of getting a taxi in the French Riviera. I landed in Nice many years ago, and I had to go all the way to Monaco, which was not a trivial taxi ride. And the moment I got in the taxi and said where I wanted to go, he asked, was it cash or credit? Because it was cheaper if it was cash. I suspect it had something to do with paying taxes to the French regime, which will be slightly tied into what I'm going to say, because I want to make a few basic points about public policy and entrepreneurship and economic growth. But the first thing is to underscore why economic growth is important. Because sometimes when I talk to politicians in America, I get the feeling they don't really grasp why it's important. If you have an economy like Italy that, I mean, they'd be lucky now if they were growing 1% a year. But if you grow 1% a year, it takes you 70 years to double your GDP. On the other hand, if you have, not even Hong Kong type growth, but if you have just decent 3 to 4% growth, it's just a couple of decades you can double your GDP. And when you think about the lost economic output and the impact that has on people's living standards, growth is incredibly important. So the question then is, how do we get growth? Well, there are two factors of production. This is very, very simple. I'm an economist. I can't help but focus on these simple things. But it's so important because a lot of politicians and policymakers in America and around the world, they don't understand it. It doesn't matter whether you have the most left-wing economist in the world or a good economist. There's two factors of production. That's it. There's capital and labor. And if you want more economic output, you either have to get more labor, more capital, or you have to use your existing labor and capital more efficiently. I mean, Paul Krugman, I think, would say the exact same thing. Where we would disagree is on this part. Labor and capital are the ingredients. It's sort of like you're making dinner. Who's the chef that's going to put the dinner together? Well, the chef in a market economy is the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur is the one who's figuring out, as the last question we had, how are you figuring out the products and the goods and what needs of the consumers are you going to meet, that's not going to be a government bureaucrat. It's going to be someone in the private sector. And so you have to ask yourself, what chef do you want? Well, you have the political chefs. They don't do a very good job. They give us things in America like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And we saw how well that worked out with the housing crisis, whereas private sector entrepreneurs, they don't always succeed. But here's the big difference between the private sector and the government. In the private sector, there's a feedback mechanism called profit and loss. If you make a mistake, and most entrepreneurs do, every successful small business, there are probably 8 or 9 that fail. And the thing is, in the private sector, you get rewarded if you do the right thing, if you're meeting the needs of consumers. And the government, though, if you have a program that fails, in all likelihood, that just becomes the excuse to have an even bigger budget next year. So how do you get more growth? We know growth matters. We know entrepreneurs matter for growth. Well, what are the conditions that give us better performance for entrepreneurs, the more conducive environment that was talked about in the keynote presentation? I always go to Economic Freedom of the World, published by the Fraser Institute in conjunction with lots of other cooperating think tanks around the world. And you'll see that there are 5 major factors: rule of law and property rights, stable money, modest fiscal burden, open trade, and a reasonable regulatory burden. And you look at, they rate 152 countries. And my final slide is simply to sort of set the stage for the discussion. What about Sweden? Well, the good news about Sweden, you're in the top 10 on 2 categories. That's pretty impressive. A lot of countries aren't anywhere near the top 10 on any categories. But Sweden's in the top 10 for monetary policy and rule of law and property rights. And Sweden does reasonably well. Now, we're measuring against other countries. So it could be that you're not doing well, just other countries are doing even worse. It's sort of like, the 2 guys are out camping, and all of a sudden this big bear comes charging over a hill, and the one guy starts putting on his sneakers, and his friend says, "You can't outrun a bear." And he says to his friend, "I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you." So maybe Sweden, I'm sure, has too much regulation and too much protectionism, but you're still doing better than most countries in the world. Here's where Sweden does a terrible job. And just on the basis of the Economic Freedom of the World data, I suspect this must be a big challenge for entrepreneurs. Your tax rates are too high, and the burden of government spending is diverting far too many resources from the productive sector of the economy. And that would be my opening thoughts.
Thank you. We'll have time to come back to the taxing question. Let me give the floor to you, Richard Rahn, who is also a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. Ask the same question to you. What do we need to get growth, and what are the big problems that you see?
Since we're all starting off with is this working okay? Starting off with taxi cab stories in France. Last July, I had gone to some meetings in the Isle of Jersey. I took the ferry from Isle of Jersey to St. Malo, or Malo, I guess it is in France. I got there, and it was a rainy evening, and a whole boatload of passengers getting off the ferry. Now, any place else in the world I've ever been, there would be a line of taxi cabs because there was all these people who needed taxi cabs. Of course, there was no taxi cab at all. And I was there with a friend, and we looked around, and this looked fairly hopeless, but we could see the walled city a mile or so down this long pier. It was raining, so we put out our umbrellas. We hiked all the way down to the city. We figured surely we could get a taxi cab there because our hotel was a couple miles away. Get down there, no cabs. And I kept going to shops and said, "How do you get a cab?" And nobody seemed to know. Then there was a police car outside the wall, and Charlotte mentioned the police cars. And I went up to it and asked about a cab. So a few minutes, he's on the phone. A cab shows up. And I knew there had to be some regulatory impediment, because any place else in the world, if you allow free markets, anybody who has a car will show up. Now we have this whole Uber experience. Has Uber reached Sweden yet? And of course, because you have taxi cabs are regulated in most cities in the world. Anyway, let's see if I do this right. I'm going to go through just a few. This is global economic growth is slowing. And off the right here, these are some IMF data, and they're way too optimistic, as we'll point out later on as Dan and I get through these things. But real world GDP, we had a really good spurt in the end of the 90s and the first part of the 2000s, but things are going bad. Here is, you can see this big drop in world economic growth. And again, these projections here, that's not going to occur. The IMF is always wrong and always optimistic. This is the US Fed. This is their forecast. Each year they start off and saying, we're going to have 4% economic growth next year. And of course, it never happens. It always goes down to 2. And they do this every year, which shows their models are misspecified and they use the wrong assumptions. I mean, they keep doing it over and over again. It's sort of like the global warming models. Each year they tell you it's going to be very much warmer. And of course, for the last 19 years, it hasn't. In fact, the US administration, we had a dismal first quarter, only 0.2% growth, basically flat. So the administration said, oh, the reason we had such poor economic performance was insufficient global warming. Actually, they said cold weather, but isn't that insufficient global warming? Oh, here, this one here. Entrepreneur. You're trying to figure, say you're an automobile manufacturer, a manufacturer of anything, and you've got plants both in Europe and the US. Look at this fluctuation in Europe of the euro and the dollar. How do you plan for this? And of course, the reason we have these huge fluctuations is not because there's those fundamental changes in the European economy versus the American. It is because of policy mistakes. But let's say you're an automobile manufacturer, you're Volkswagen. Should you put a plant in Alabama or should you put it in Germany? How do you make a decision when you've got this kind of fluctuation in the exchange of the currencies? Interest rates, Eurozone interest rates. Now you've got negative. What's the interest rate here in Sweden? I meant to check. 25 basis points? Yeah. Minus. Oh, you got negative too. Okay. Why don't you just keep bundles of cash rather than actually be in the bank? You've got negative interest. This is the enormous problem. And people don't realize what's really happening here. This is a tax on savers. It's happening in the US, it's happening all through Europe. Because normally the real rate of interest is normally about 3%, 2.5% to 3%. Long-term average, that's above inflation. So if you've got 2% inflation, you ought to have a savings rate for about 5%. That's on the safest investments, government bonds and so forth. Now we're getting 0. That difference is a tax imposed by the central banks on people. In our country, only the Congress is supposed to levy a tax, but of course that's been ignored because the central banks are levying this huge tax on savers, which is deadly for entrepreneurs, and it's one reason we're not growing. Okay, that's it for me. In terms of the slides, I've got, I have 30 to go, but I'll spare you all that. I have been an entrepreneur. I've been a professor of economics, and now I'm a senior fellow at Cato with Dan, and but I've actually built businesses. And it amazes me you have any businesses in Europe at all. When Charlotte mentioned the hiring, we had a little semiconductor business in the US, and we were bringing scientists from around the world, and we were building pure silicon wafers, substrates for semiconductors. And we were expanding the business very rapidly. And so people were coming in, we were primarily hiring technical sorts. But we could expand that rapidly because we could hire rapidly because we knew if somebody didn't work out, we could immediately fire them. We have employment at will. And when I see where you can't fire people, as a person who's been a businessman and an entrepreneur, I wouldn't hire anybody. If because a number of people don't work out. I guess in France, you're stuck with them for life, sort of like one of your relatives. Anyway, I'll let it go with that.
I think let me introduce the rest of our speakers. First of all, Christian Sandström, who's an associate professor at the Chalmers University of Technology and the Ratio Institute. Welcome. And I think you could all stand up so we could have a discussion together.
Sure.
And Staffan Wennberg, who's chairman of the World Taxpayers Association. And also Charlotte, welcome. And Anders.
Richard, good to see you.
Anders, I think you could...
Jag ställer mig här så jag liksom blandar upp
Ja,
lite.
hoppa in här.
me. Just,
Killar.
Ja.
Så det är lite mer.
so if we focus on Europe, what would you say? Could you rank the biggest problems? What are the I mean, you mentioned taxation, regulations. Of course, Europe is a continent with many countries, but are there some problems that are particularly important that you see? Let's start.
I always go to that Economic Freedom of the World Index. In Northern Europe, it's the fiscal burden. What I mentioned about Sweden is also true for Germany, for Denmark. But as you go farther south in Europe, you get big problems with rule of law, property rights, and regulation. Now, Europe as a whole, because of the EU, the trade score is pretty much the same for everybody. But Northern Europe, fiscal burden's bad in Southern Europe, but they augment that with really bad corruption and rule of law issues and things like that.
One thing that's been growing, which affects all of Europe and the US, in fact, all the developed countries, is the huge growth in financial regulation. This whole idea they're trying to harmonize tax bases around the world and trying to make sure that nobody avoids paying a tax by moving money from one country to another. It is absolutely deadly. The forms, the bureaucracy, and the room for corruption from all this effort. It's not going to bring any tax revenue in, but it's really slowing the mobility of capital around the world. And it's making international payments harder and harder, which just slows economic growth, no benefit. The only people who benefit are the tax lawyers and the government bureaucrats.
You're looking at me and I'm an academic.
I know.
It's your fault.
This is sort of funny.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting to note here that what you're highlighting here are the need for major substantial reforms. And going back then to the interests behind that makes it very difficult to enact those reforms. What you see first and foremost, I think, in Sweden with regard to entrepreneurship, but also throughout Europe, is you see those marginal little tiny things. You know, the Prime Minister goes out and says, you know, we're going to spend another 100 million on government loans to businesses. 100 million krona. I mean, it's a ridiculous amount. Yeah. There's no money at all, but you can say that you do something, instead avoiding the major hurdles that you highlighted, for instance, Charlotte.
Charlotte?
What the main obstacles, was it? The main
Yeah,
reforms?
the biggest problems.
Biggest problems
you
in
see
Europe.
yeah.
Okay. I think labor laws, as I mentioned, is essential. I think taxation too, of course, at least for Northern Europe, for Sweden, it is definitely. I think then also the euro itself is a challenge, because you need, if you cannot use your currency to make your country competitive, you need to make this internal devaluation, and not all the countries would have the courage, and they can't do it. The Baltics did, because they had this political pressure from Russia. Greece is not capable, apparently, to do it. And although I'm a great friend, I am, of the euro, I love Europe. I think Europe is a great thing, and I like the euro as well. But I think it has challenges that will make it difficult for some countries to compete. They need to work it from the inside as well.
Okay, well, across Europe you have about 50% of the spending is government spending. And of course, this if nothing else, this slows down the whole economy. And this is more likely to go up than down. And in some countries are like 55. You have France, Denmark, high up. Sweden is about 50, and some countries are below that. On the other hand, I think one can see some light in the tunnel, so to say, with Europe. Even Spain has a slight growth. Can you hear? Yeah. 1.5%, and the Spanish car industry, which no one knows much about. I mean, the Sedan factory outside Barcelona is now producing more cars at good quality than the whole Italian car industry. So things are happening, and I'm quite a bit in Spain, and even there it's ticking up a bit. So I think it's not totally hopeless. I think there's hope for Europe as well.
You're optimistic. Do you agree, the rest of you?
Sorry?
Are you as optimistic as Staffan as things going in the right direction?
It can't really get any worse, can it? So, or maybe it can.
There are data projections over the next several decades for the various countries. From the European Commission does these estimates, the BIS, Bank for International Settlements, the IMF, all these estimates, because of the changing demographics of our countries, lower birth rates, increased lifespans, the fiscal pressures that we face now, which are terrible, unless there's real structural entitlement reform, they're going to get worse. So in other words, all the trouble we're seeing in Greece, I mean, Spain's demographics are a nightmare. They're almost as bad as Japan. So yes, there are glimmers of light. You can look at almost any country and see some positive reform. I'm just worried that the big picture, that this demographic tidal wave is going to swamp these positive reforms. So I'm very, very concerned. Unless a country like Greece collapses, and unless the politicians in other countries learn the right lessons, I'm going to be in the pessimistic camp.
I'm going to agree with my friend and associate Dan here, because what has happened, even more so than America, is Europeans have forgotten how to breed. When I was a kid, Italians had big families. The average Italian woman only has 1.2 children, and you need 2.1 just for replacement. And I've done a lot of work down in the Balkans, and you see a huge decline in population there. In Bulgaria, I was co-chairman of the transition team 25 years ago, and at that point, Bulgaria had about 8.7 million. It's now down to about 6.7 million, and many of the best and the brightest of the young people came to other parts in Europe and to the U.S., and you just see the country being hollowed out. Russia, we haven't spoken about Russia, but that is a demographic disaster. The men had very short lifespans, as you know, and they're not breeding, and the good people, again, are fleeing, Ukraine even more so, and this does not bode well. And even going across the world into Asia, the Chinese one-child policy has not worked out, because you've got this huge number of single males who can't get wives, and now they've had the policy long enough, they're going to start having a big dependency ratio problem like you have here in Europe. We'll have a lot of old men and not the people there to be providing the output to support them. Japan, Dan mentioned. Japan is just an absolute demographic disaster and a fiscal disaster. And you see all this stuff coming along. I tend to be an optimist about humans in general, because technology will overcome a lot of this. But the policies are going so much the wrong way, and again, these demographics, and I think the next few years are going to be very, very difficult.
Yeah, now adding to the demographic dilemma, the overall challenge I think we have in Sweden, but throughout Europe is you have in an economy structural change, so jobs are gone, they're destroyed, and that's part of it. But that is a serious concern if the amount of new jobs created is lower than the amount of jobs that is being destroyed. And during the period 1950 up until 2005, no new jobs net were created in the private sector in Sweden. And I would be very surprised if it looks any different in other European countries. So you do not create new jobs, and I think that is highly related to the issue of taxation, because an established job in an established industry with established capital has high productivity, which motivates a high wage. Now, how can you justify that kind of high wage in a new company where there is very little of certainty and the contracts that you need to have in place? So we love to talk about entrepreneurship, but we really struggle to walk the talk as well.
So there are a lot of problems. What solutions do you see? What reforms do we need? I think that's an interesting reform agenda to get more children. But
I think also, may I say something?
Yeah.
Because it's always talk about growth, and you put figures on that. That's fine. But I also that is growth per capita. It's GDP per capita that's interesting. It's not necessarily growth per se, because you've got people coming into Sweden, for example. We got some growth in Sweden, and the population is growing because we got lots of immigration. In the States, you got lots of South Americans coming in, and which is fine. And in Japan, if you go to Japan, people are quite okay. If you look at the living standard, it's okay. It's quite, and if you compare our living standard in Europe, in general at least, the average, now and 10 years back, it's still slightly better now. You consume more. So, I mean, I think you need to put the growth in combination with the per capita, with the GDP per capita. And that is lacking, I think, in the discussion completely. And that always surprised me, actually.
I want to add one thing to it.
Yes.
The growth in U.S. population today was just reported in the Wall Street Journal was not so much from Mexico anymore. It's China.
It's China.
China's our biggest single import. But there's a solution here for Europe, because there is a country that's actually doing it right in Europe. It's called Switzerland. They have a growing population. They have basically pretty much employment at will. And I was in a factory this past week in a small town in Switzerland which makes rail cars, the trams and other types of rail cars. Started 20 years ago. The fellow who started this goes into an industry which has been around for 200 years. He picks a town where they have the highest wages in the world, and you say, how can this possibly be? Well, it's technology and quality. And the Swiss are doing many things. They're saddled with many of the problems Europe had, but they're overcoming. And they're actually reducing their debt GDP ratio, and they've got sensible medical and social security systems, and it's working. So you have an example right in the center of Europe of what to do.
Actually, let me add one thing about Switzerland, because all the problems with government spending, the Swiss voters back in, I think, 2001 or 2002, voted to enact something called the debt brake. And now, even though it's called the debt brake, it's really a spending cap, because it in effect says that spending can't grow faster than a rolling 5-year average of revenue. And ever since that debt brake went into effect, the burden of government spending has fallen as a share of GDP, not by much, but by some. But what's really amazing, while the rest of Europe is sort of spinning off in the wrong direction, having this firm spending cap in place, forcing the politicians to actually make trade-offs and set priorities, has been a wonderful discipline in Switzerland. And I think copying that specifically would be very, very helpful for other countries, because when you look, again, the demographics, the government spending, these dependency ratios over time, that's what's going to, I think, tip a lot of European countries into Greek-style crisis.
Christian touched on the thing of productivity, which I think is really key. I mean, across Europe, and Sweden has one of the highest, I think higher than Germany, productivity, and we've been forced into it since the 70s, with big companies and the unions and pushing out low-cost labor. And as an example, take the banking sector. In the town I live outside Stockholm, 40,000 people, we have 5 banks, and you hardly ever go there because you do everything on your computer. I'm a lot in a small town in Spain, where we have a place, and in that town of 20,000 people, there are probably like 30 or 40 banks where people go all the time. And Spain, when they got the euro, all the living standard went up like this, and they're expecting, the bank people in Spain are expecting to make the money that they do in Sweden, but I mean, this can't happen. So productivity is really key to the future, and increasing productivity.
I have just a short question about the Swiss example. I remember my tax cab history was one took a cab from the airport in Geneva to the downtown of Geneva, and I actually got more money back from the cab driver because he was doing business on the stock market all the way downtown. So I got more money. I think that's really high productivity in the cab business. But I'm not really sure that all of Europe we talk about Uber. Does Europe need American innovations to get through those regulations, or can we invent them ourselves?
Well, of course you can invent themselves. Actually, I've got a great fondness for Sweden for many reasons. One is I've invested into a Swedish fund on the Wallenberg fund, so it's done very, very well for me over the years. But you look at best practices. A couple of us are working on a film now to take a look at best practices of countries around the world. And there's no one country that has it all. Again, the Swiss have done most things better than most others. But each country has done certain things extremely well, or not each, but many of them have. And you try to figure out, well, let's say with the Social Security, the pension systems, you've partially adopted the one that was developed in Chile by Jose Piñera. That works. It does because it's you own your own pension, and it has enormous advantages. So we know how to cure the pension system problem. And for each of the major problems, Dan was pointing out the spending brake. Well, we can actually control government spending if we're forced to. And with the regulatory reforms, if we had real cost-benefit analysis, which some places do, then you don't have this ever-growing regulatory burden. So the solutions are there, and just identify them and getting others to both understand them and adopt them.
So let's talk a bit more about role models. I mean, you mentioned Switzerland. When I grew up in the 1980s in Sweden, pro-market people could say that we need to be more like a normal European country in Sweden. And nowadays, I'm not sure that's such a good advice anymore. So which countries could we look at except from Switzerland? I mean, Barbara Kolm, who isn't here today, unfortunately, she mentioned Estonia in Svensk Tidskrift today as the startup nation of Europe. So, yeah, Charlotte.
Yeah, the Baltics, I would say,
The
is
Baltics,
really,
yeah.
and the way that they did this internal devaluation is incredible. But this is because of the political pressure. I've learned, actually, I'm a bit a slow learner, I think, but I learned over the last maybe 10 years that economy is one thing and politics is another thing. But the thing is that you can't solve the economics without going through the politics. And I think the politicians and the politics is the challenge, really. How do you look at what's happening in Greece, for example. Everybody knows it's bankrupt. You know, everybody knows it's bankrupt. It's like somebody saying you give them some money. It's like giving money to your teenage son. You know, you're never going to get it back. And it's still the Minister of Finance is fighting, and you think why? You know, it's politics, and you have to. I think you have to work a lot more on the politics side, on the politicians themselves, and it's all democracies. It's complicated. That's why it's important to have this discussion go on, and I think it's really, really important, because if you don't do that, you might end up with things that you do not want. And it's not 100 years ago since we had the World War, for example, and it's always a threat there all the time. So we need to work on that one.
Let me add one thing to that, because I think you're right. And I would actually augment what you said by saying there's a real problem with what I call social or cultural capital, the attitudes of people. In Greece, when you add up the number of people who are getting some sort of government welfare or disability check, and you add them to the number of people on government payrolls, notice I didn't say government workers because they probably aren't doing anything, and then you add to them the number of people who are on government retirement programs, and for certain hazardous professions in Greece, like hairdressing, you can retire as early as age 48 on the taxpayers. You add up all these different groups, you have well more than 50% of your voting age population. And they've been told for decades by politicians of all the major parties, government owes you a living. They owe you health care. They owe you jobs. They owe you housing, everything. And I don't think, you said worried about bad things happening. I wouldn't be surprised if Greece is not a democracy within 5 or 10 years, because I think it's become a fundamentally ungovernable place because everyone thinks that they have the right to live off other people. But if nobody's producing anymore and the tax rates keep, the IMF keeps going in saying, squeeze the tax rate up even higher, while the Greek politicians, of course, are doing everything they can not to cut any of the spending or to control the public sector, the math doesn't work. And I really worry about what it's going to mean in the near future, a breakdown of some sort.
Then
Yes.
what you're
And
saying
Russia.
about Greece is exactly what the Swedish government was saying in the 70s here. You know, don't worry about a thing, you're going to get a pension, health care, everything's taken care of. But we did not end up like Greece, and you can sort of wonder what was the difference.
That's because you're Swedes.
Well, maybe
And you-
it should be in our Lutheran heritage.
Yeah,
I-
but that has a lot to do with it. Because actually, I had looked at, I had worked all through the Eastern European countries during the transition. And in the Southern European countries, which did not have the Lutheran tradition, were low trust countries, versus Estonia. I was just in Estonia a couple days ago. And you see the enormous difference. And there's a lot of that cultural attitude, and I don't know how we quite measure it. But when you talked about the politics, what we really need is the benevolent dictator that Hong Kong had. I mean, Hong Kong's growth, they didn't have an elected democracy, but they had the British overlords who made sure you had the rule of law, honest judges, protection of private property, and the rest was up to them. Now, it's very hard to have these benevolent dictators. Britain was much better with Hong Kong than it was with Britain itself, of course, because there they had democracy. But again, I go back to the Swiss because I keep struggling with this. We see the problems in democracy, and as Dan pointed out, people always want to vote for other people to pay their bills, and our founding fathers understood this. Thomas Jefferson said, once people realize they can vote themselves benefits, all was lost. But again, the Swiss, because the democracy is right at the town level. Nobody knows who the Swiss president is. Anybody here can tell me who the Swiss president is? Anybody know? It's a woman. Does that help you? But because they govern at the very lowest level, and so people are well aware of the burdens of the government because most of the spending is in what they call the commune, the town level, or at the canton, and there's a lot of competition between the cantons, and that's helped stop this, where Christian tries to spend my money and I try to spend his.
I'll let you comment, Christian, then we can take some questions about Sweden as well.
So the examples that are raised here, the Baltic countries, Sweden undergoing actually a lot of structural change over the past 20, 25 years, Switzerland. I would like to add New Zealand and Australia. If you look at the transition that their economies have gone through over, since the 1980s and onwards. What do they all have in common? They are rather small economies, rather small populations, more or less homogeneous, where there is a high degree of trust in society. Just to point that out, and Sweden has one case of dealing with the Uber situation going back to the 1980s and the deregulation of financial markets, the introduction of automated exchanges, brokers not doing the physical work of paper related. We went through that transition through institutional entrepreneurship, and it fueled an export success, which was OM that NASDAQ acquired a couple of years ago. And I don't think that would have been possible either in a large, heterogeneous country with very low degrees of trust.
But Greece is rather small and homogeneous as well.
But no
Exceptions.
trust.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So,
Yes, we are talking about Europe and the rest of the world and role models and so on. I think Staffan has something to say about Sweden. You have some presentation.
Sure, I can have a few pictures. Actually, I was prepared to talk about entrepreneurship, so we start.
Are we moving?
Throw up a couple of pictures.
Here, we'll get in.
Could you
Just
start
a-
perhaps to tell us about the World Tax Association?
Well,
because that's
yes,
perhaps in it.
since almost a year ago, I'm chairman of the World Taxpayers Association, which is a network of taxpayers organizations across the world in about 60 countries, 40 countries, about 60 organizations. And I'm doing what my Canadian friend calls a reboot of the whole thing, where we increasing communications with the guys in Africa, Asia. We have Chinese, Koreans, and so on, and really trying to do a communications work with this. And so far, it's interesting. We have a new webpage, www.worldtaxpayers.org. I do a monthly letter to everybody and to some other people, and we'll see where it goes. But it's interesting to get the feedback. Guys in Africa are having problems with corruptions. The organization in Beijing has just been taken over by the government because it's getting too big. We don't have that problem in Sweden, where the Swedish organization is getting too small, but that's another issue. Anyway, everybody knows what this is. It's looked like this way for very long time, and it's been missed by entrepreneurs. And this is about entrepreneurship. It's really the basic of entrepreneurship is doing something better, doing something different, wanting to create something. It's not really about making money, but anyway, and this was untouched by entrepreneurs for a long time. Then this is a French version. It's a guillotine. You see the guillotine coming down there. The poor rat, its head is cut off. So this was a development. It's a little bit complicated, like all French stuff, like a French car. Then this is the IKEA version, the Swedish version. It has an extra security band, of course. It has some text in Viking script and so on. And then this is the American one, pest control garden system, high tech. And the next step on this is you do an app on your iPhone, and you can trace the mice moving around the house. So anyway, that's entrepreneurship is really about wanting to create something. I was fortunate a few years ago, 6 years ago, to be involved with some friends, with a couple of guys who were starting a company in Stockholm, selling advertising or creating advertising in your cell phones, which maybe many people don't like, called Whitespace. And these guys had mortgaged their apartment and worked for 5 years on this idea. Today they have 250 people employed, of which 80 people in Bangladesh doing the programming, the ad stuff, and they are established all across Europe. So it's fun when there's a success story. Okay, now this I think is Swedish privatization. I'd like to say something about, because I think in many countries this is a good chance to privatize and to be entrepreneurial. Today, 20% of the welfare overall in Sweden is privatized. Is primary school 10%, care of old 10%, preschool 20%, and the handicapped and so on. Sending people to their homes and taking care of them. About half is privatized. Now, my sister-in-law, she works with these things, and her job is to increase the sort of customer care time from 50% to 65%. So that when they drive around their little cars, they can spend that much more time in the homes of people. So this, when you see this, that only 50% is actually effective time, so to say. It's an open area for entrepreneurs to do this better. And I think there are a lot of people who've started businesses in the welfare sector in Sweden over the last 20 years or so. And it's been so highly successful that it's grown, and the risk capitals have gotten involved in it and clamping it together, building big corporations, running tax schemes through Luxembourg. And then, of course, in the last election, the government or the parties step in on the left side and said, hey, we don't want our tax money disappearing to Luxembourg. We want you to pay taxes in Sweden. We have to clamp down on this. It's gone too well, the privatization, too fast and too well, in their mind. So this is this thing. I think I'll stop here and just have some other stuff. We can take some other time about subsidizing housework and so on in Sweden, but if we have time we can get involved in that. Okay, so that's a tip to everybody who's not from Sweden. Start privatizing the welfare sector.
So, thank you. Staffan, do you think we can go on in Sweden and have a higher level? If you don't think about the politicians now, if you think more of
absolutely
what the possibilities.
I think we've just started. I think there's a lot of potential and for small entrepreneurs and so on. In this area, many women, on the whole in Sweden, there are very few women entrepreneurs. That's one of the lowest rates in Europe. Only 2 other countries that have a lower rate. And in this area, in this field, 2 out of 3 of the entrepreneurs are women. And 40% of the employees, 40-45, are born outside Sweden. And 80% of the people employed are women. So this is also a great area for women to be involved in as entrepreneur.
Do you think there could be some sort of Swedish IKEA in this area?
I would say I hope not. It's
with extra security.
Have that scale of something like this. I think this is a typical business that you do small. I mean, most of these, we have in Sweden two big companies that are providing this sort of service that have about 10% of the market. Then we have about 20 who are medium size, 50, 100 million turnover, and the rest are really small. And I think it's a good thing that they are small.
Anyone wants to comment?
I want to ask a question here. I didn't realize that about so few women entrepreneurs in Sweden. What's the reason for that? I would have thought it would be quite a bit different because you've had sort of gender equality for so long.
Anyone?
You want to answer it? Or
I tell you what, this about gender equality is more like a talking thing than in reality, I would say. And I also think that in general, you're quite well off if you're employed. You get, I think it's now 18 months maternity leave. 18 months, 8 months, with more or less a decent pay. And it's risky. You risk your money, you risk maybe your house, the mortgage, whatever. And the environment is not really so conducive. And the sector, as you said, the sector, if you talk about care, for example, care about children, elderly people, it's all been run by the state. It's been centralized and not privatized. So there's been limited or less, I'd say, opportunities in general.
If you think
Is
of
that-
it,
is that-
yeah, I think so. If you think of a typical entrepreneur, as you define it, might be a small building company where the man works, then the wife works in as you say, a big company or in the community or as a nurse or something like that. Or as a teacher. That's a combination typically.
And I'll tell you about we have something called ROT and something called RUT. And you know, ROT, it's a deduction you can make in your taxation when you pay your taxes, where if you rebuild your house, it's not very much money, but some money. And for a long time, it stated that, and they just was it 5 years ago or something? They introduced RUT, something 6 years ago, because there's been a lot of discussions about RUT is when you do interior things, you clean your house or you do gardening and things like soft services, and that was not permitted to have a tax deduction, because it's like doing the work outside the house is okay, or the bathroom maybe, but not doing the maintenance. And it's an idea that Swedes have about who is serving who, you know.
I have a
Am
couple
I right?
I'll show you a couple of slides of that. We had
Something in that area.
it's really this is what leads into taxes. I mean,
It's
you have to have a
interesting.
big. You get a 50% tax break if you're doing repair work on your house, or if you have somebody coming to look after your children, and so on. It's been tremendously successful. It's grown so rapidly that the new government is putting a ceiling on this.
It's too successful.
It's going to be created 11,000 full-time jobs, so this will be 1,000. Growth rate of this home service, 16% in 2013 and 20 to 25, 2014. Over 500,000 customers in Sweden, and as you see, women managers and so on. And 5.5 billion Swedish kronor. That's getting $800 million, something like that. And then here, 10% are big, middle, and 150 fair size, but most are small. And you come. You come to. I was going to say the male sector, but I'm not allowed to say that. But in Sweden, 20,000 sort of black jobs have become white jobs, I think. 17 billion kronor has been paid out, which totals 34 billion kronor. That's, as a comparison, the whole Swedish military budget is about 42 billion. So it's a huge amount of money. So that the 50% tax break is being reduced to 30 next year. The government thinks it will save 6 billion. So we'll see.
So
how that goes.
this could be a big opportunity for entrepreneurship, but the
It
rules
has been
in
a
Sweden is now
yes,
changing.
tremendous. And
Yeah.
now these entrepreneurs or people are hesitant to see. They will want to see how this plays out.
I think Maria has some.
Yeah, I think we have a comment from the audience or a question. Valdemar Ingdal.
Hello. Thank you. The secret ingredients to the source of affluence, I think it's free market thoughts. And unfortunately, that one is lacking in most of Europe and the US. When I go to Silicon Valley, I go to the temple of entrepreneurship, where these ideas should be living, but it's solid Obama country. And the problem, I think, is in how free markets ideas have been applied in Europe, in Sweden, educating the public of what is a free market. And you often see that a free market is created in the welfare sector by the government opening up, keeping the finances tight and tax regulated. So how do entrepreneurs earn money? Well, they do it by conforming, by not inventing new things or smarter products. And this is a very tricky problem because it's a good thing to leave the old government administrated healthcare service, etc. We all can see it in Sweden. But the problem is that you're showing a big part of the population that entrepreneurship and free markets are rent-seeking.
Anyone who wants to comment on that?
Well, I'll just say that in the U.S., the blurred line between capitalism, genuine capitalism, and cronyism is not well understood by people. And so you have a lot of Americans, they think about, say, the financial sector, they think about the TARP bailout, and they get upset and they get angry, and they blame that on capitalism. No, that was a government action to subsidize and then bail out. And you identified something very important, but how do we solve it? I'm not sure.
I think this goes on to my next question. Christian, we talked about, you wrote an article about this researcher, what we should call her, Mariana Mazzucato. Perhaps you have heard about her. She wrote about the innovative state, that the government is behind everything. All innovations come actually from the government. And this is a lot of the political climate in Sweden today. The new government, and so I say, it's innovations will be created, centralized by the government. And you wrote an article about that. Please tell us.
Yeah, I reviewed that book for a Swedish sort of journal called Economic Debate or Ekonomisk Debatt, essentially going through the article piece by piece, where the argument is more or less you have innovation without entrepreneurship, or stating, well, of course there is entrepreneurship, but, and then giving this grand praise to the role of the state with regard to science, new technology, etc. And of course, I mean, science, technology, it has sort of some properties of a public good, and there might be a role for the state to play here in terms of ensuring that there is enough supply of it in society. But from there to the conclusions that are being drawn in this research, and which is then taken as a source of legitimacy for the investments that are being done. Let's say it's anecdotal was one thing, and a lot of factual errors. I mean, it was stated that all the basic technologies in the iPhone are created by the state, and you know, the image sensor is not created by the state, was created by Kodak Research Labs. It's the same with the microprocessor, and all these sort of Nobel Prize award-winning inventions are just not attended to. So there is a role for the state, but which one is it? And I don't think that book helps you any further in that question, really.
Of course, we talk about entrepreneurship. When you have politicians, they say, we love entrepreneurs, but then they say we have to help them.
And rather than add a little bit of help here, a little bit of support there, a little bit of more help, which is then paid for via the taxes, then creating those groundbreaking, substantial reforms that actually make a difference.
Yes.
So you put more money into, let's say, public capital, and then that becomes maybe 1.5% of the overall financial market, or you know, but it's still a very small number compared to the overall. And politics should be concerned with getting the markets to function properly.
And it opens up, as Dan said, so to crony capitalism possibilities.
Part of the problem is just the structure. When government says they're going to come in and help the entrepreneur, and particularly help the high-tech side, the way it works in the U.S., and I expect most other countries, they say, well, this is going to be the new technology. Somebody in government supposedly figures this out, and then what they do is award contracts for what they think. But of course, they never think of total new things. And fortunately, Steve Jobs was not looking for government contracts when he did the iPad and a number of the other innovations, or he would never had them occur. And I mentioned I had been in the semiconductor business, and we actually had government contracts from the Defense Department. They wanted certain things, and but so you find yourself being forced into their particular mold of things they want rather than things you think might actually have a bigger potential in the future. And so, you know, Hayek had taught us all that the limits of knowledge. And we think of the great innovations that were never done by government. And government tries to pick up and then locks people into old technologies rather than new technologies.
Christian, do you?
So there is the information or the knowledge problem related to government interventions here, for sure. Then there is also the incentive problem, that any support systems might be subject to rent-seeking or opportunistic behavior of various kinds. And a properly crafted policy needs to take those things into account. And there are examples of countries which have had quite an interventionist technology policy. You look at Taiwan, you look at Japan going back to the 1960s, 1970s, and they were proactive, but they were not so in the sense of trying to be the market or creating support structures that are then exploited by shady rent seekers.
We have a question from the floor here.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Miloš Popović, and I come from some of those, little corrupted countries from the Southern Europe. I basically come from Montenegro. I believe that our colleagues from US have heard of University of Donja Gorica, where I teach as a teaching assistant. But currently, I'm here as employer of a central bank over some traineeship program, and I'm still not aware enough of Sweden, so I would not comment on the economical side and economical system of Sweden. But I would like to bring a focus again to Europe and to ask our U.S. fellows, what do they think of that free trade agreement between Europe and U.S.? What changes is that agreement going to bring? Because eventually it's going to go, I don't know, closing up those economies. Eventually, because U.S. is basically those two are so equal economies. So what kind of philosophical change is going to bring it to Europe? Is Europe going to stop being welfare state, or what? According to your opinion, what do you think is going to happen? Or do Europe is going to go by Obama's opinion and again start becoming a welfare state? Clear enough.
I'm in favor of the free trade agreement, but I don't view it as a giant issue, because from the end of World War II till today, we've made tremendous progress on getting rid of a lot of trade barriers, and now we have a small slice still to go, and it's good that they're negotiating that. There's some managed trade and intervention in there as well, so it's not perfect. I would just prefer unilateral free trade like Hong Kong, but this is a positive step, but I don't think it's a groundbreaking step. I don't think this additional slice of open trade is going to force some sort of structural change in Europe. What's going to force structural change in Europe or lead to the loss of democracy and economic chaos will be this demographic bubble combined with the poorly designed entitlement programs. That to me, that's the elephant, and the trade agreement is like the trunk of the elephant or an ear of the elephant.
But for the U.S., free trade with Asia is more important than free trade with Europe.
Probably, but again, I mean, we've made so much progress as a world in bringing down trade barriers ever since World War II. It's one of the good success stories that we have to tell in terms of global economic policy. And yes, there are still some barriers, and I'm glad that we're talking with Asia. I'm glad we're talking with Europe. Hopefully we'll make some more progress, but I don't view that as the crisis area that needs to be addressed. I view it fiscal policy as the crisis.
Actually, it was a good sign, though, from our questioner. I've had the privilege of speaking at your university. I think you have too, haven't you? There, and it's a private university. It was an entrepreneurial thing. Years ago, this goes back, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, when Montenegro was still struggling to get out of the...
Serbia.
Yeah, well, when Yugoslavia was breaking up, and some of us had advocated that Montenegro actually become a special economic zone, just a totally free trade and a financial zone also. It had the potential back then, but too many of your politicians wanted to be in the EU, and worse things could happen to you. But I'm a great fan of Montenegro. And for those
it has a flat tax.
Yeah, and for those of you who have never been to Montenegro, it is one of the great tourist destinations. It is one of the beautiful countries, and I'm not being paid to say this. If you want to give me a but it is just absolutely just glorious along the Adriatic there.
I think we have another question, Lars.
Yes, my name is Lars Tobison, and it just so happens that my wife and myself are flying to Nice tomorrow. We will not try to find a cab. We are being picked up by a neighbor, and that's the way we handle it, because it's hard to find a cab, and if you do, it's very expensive. Well, anyway, I usually say that the reason why Sweden is doing a little bit better than other European countries is that we took 3 decisions during the mid-90s that were crucial. One was that we got an independent bank. Before that, politicians decided on monetary policy. Now that is independently done, and inflation is leaked. The next reason was that we enacted a pension system that actually follows the economy and means that the active generation can pay for what is needed for the old generation. And then we also installed a budgetary process. That means that we don't have any uncontrolled deficits, public deficits in the economy. We have been able to keep expenditure down, and actually we are not any longer the most indebted country and the country with the highest public expenditure. So in that sense, we're doing better. But of course, the difference, we are doing better than Greece is doing, because we managed to handle these deficiencies, structural deficiencies in the economy. But we are not as good as Switzerland. If you compare the Swedish krona to the French, to the Swiss franc, I think we have gone from 1 to 1 right after the war to today 1 to 10 almost. And the reason for that is that we have this high level of public expenditure. And why don't we use Switzerland as a model? I think the reason is that politicians don't like Switzerland because they don't have anything to say in that country. And I've tried to argue, I'm a politician myself, I've tried to argue that we should make Switzerland our model, but no interest among other parties because of the same reason as we don't know the name of the Swiss president. Thank you.
Well, let me ask a rhetorical question to the audience that I think will help drive this home. In Switzerland, government spending is about 34% of GDP. In Sweden, the government consumes about half of GDP. Does anybody here think that you're getting better government services than they get in Switzerland? Are your roads better? Is your education better? Is your healthcare better? Now, maybe on a few of these things you're better, but maybe Switzerland's better in a few areas. In general, are you getting better government for your money than Switzerland? And I think the answer almost certainly is no.
But the
And yet-
average Swede would say yes.
They would?
Yeah.
Okay, well,
I
that's,
think they would say, I don't know, because people won't know.
Oh, but they would say yes anyway, even though they don't know.
then maybe that points
yeah.
to something for Timbro and the other research organizations in Sweden to do, is to look at what's called public sector efficiency ratings that are published by things like the IMF and see what is it that they're getting for their money versus what you're getting for your money. And I suspect that kind of data might sober up some of your fellow Swedes and change their attitudes.
Let me add one thing there. Hong Kong has government spending about 18% of their GDP. Their lifespans are longer than Swedes. You have a very high lifespan. They're much higher than the U.S. Their infrastructure is beautiful. It's magnificent. It's efficient. It's clean. And you look at the government services they're providing, good education, obviously health care, and they're doing it with 18% expenditure.
I think you go in, when we're talking expenditure, we haven't talked so much about taxes or tax policy and so on. I think Sweden has about one of the 5th highest taxes, got total taxes as GDP, but we actually have, in year 2000, we had over 50% of GDP, and now it's 43, 44 something. And the revenues are actually higher. I think that's an interesting example of the Laffer curve in reality. But still, it's really high. Any comment?
Yeah, but the problem now is increasing.
Yeah.
And that is really the challenge that we have made a lot of progress during the last 10 years, and now it's...
Christian?
But I think it's also worth pointing out here that Sweden has actually low corporate taxation, but very high taxes on wages. And the US is more or less the other way around. The corporate tax, what is it, 22% in Sweden?
22.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that is very low by, I think, any international measure.
Christian, is it also true that you still can reinvest tax-free? Your companies out of retained earnings, they're not taxed if they reinvest them? I remember it used to be true years ago.
But they have changed the system. They have different systems. It was better before, but you still can, yeah.
Because that's, I mean, reinvesting
There is
capital.
discussion about regulation of that.
Yeah.
It's a big problem.
Well, the big picture on all this is that there's been a very virtuous cycle of tax competition inside Europe, and it shows up in the most mobile factors of production. So the taxation on business income and investment income in Europe is actually better than it is in the U.S., where we seem to think that we're Fortress America, and we have companies inverting. They literally will change their charter to Bermuda or Ireland or Switzerland or something like that because our tax system is so bad in terms of the treatment of business and investment income.
Should we take one more question from the audience?
Yes, hi. My name is Peter Linde, and I would like to address just one more issue. And we touched upon that when we spoke about culture. I remember when I was in high school in the mid-90s, well, actually, I don't remember any classmates talking about being entrepreneurs. They all expected to be employed. Maybe I'm wrong about this. I hope this has changed. But comparing to the US, I guess you have the American dream, which to me is like the opposite. Now, I'd like to hear your opinions. Is my perception wrong? Or if it's not, then what do we do about it? Thank you.
I think you're very, very right. I mean, we have to start with school children very young, and like in America, you know, I can become something. I think if you ask schoolboys in Sweden what they would like to become when they 6-year-olds or something when they get old, 20% at least would say professional football player because they have a role model there. I don't know. If you ask the girls, maybe they would like to be a star musician or something, but they have some dreams, and we have to foster these dreams. And then they will graduate from becoming, understand when they're 14, 15 that, well, professional football player was not quite in the books, but they can become something else. And in America, young people, at least, it's changed a little bit, unfortunately, I think, in the later years. But if someone was successful, you saw up to this person. I mean, I can be successful too. Whereas in Sweden, you sort of have a slight envy creeping under the carpet. He's become very successful. Has he done everything right? And it's a different attitude, and you have to really start changing the attitude from when the children are quite young.
I think this is it has changed though in Sweden a lot over the last 10 years or 15 years, a lot. So now it's really becoming much more accepted and encouraged. So I think it's a big difference, really. And if you look, for example, like somebody like Ingvar Kamprad, who is the owner of IKEA, he's like a star. He gets away with everything. He's moved to Switzerland and is setting up foundations, and he pays taxes to a certain extent, but he's all over the place, and he gets away with it.
And he actually moves back to Sweden now.
He moved back to Sweden because of taxation. I think
there's a great deal of entrepreneurship in the United States is done by foreign immigrants. About 25% of the companies in Silicon Valley are headed up by people who were born somewhere else. And because the U.S. has had this sort of fostering the idea of the entrepreneur, you have people from all over the world. Now we're getting all these Chinese coming in, but a lot of French people who want to be an entrepreneur. It's impossible in France, so you go to the U.S. And it's still relatively easy in the U.S. And this envy thing you mentioned, for entrepreneurs, I think of people like the late Steve Jobs. People like that are very highly regarded in the U.S. People like entrepreneurs because people understand government doesn't produce wealth, and people who are the innovators. And there is that American ethic where you say, yes, that's good. They also want to be football players, of course, too.
I'll close up this question with something bad, though. I don't really mind if in polling data people say they want to be an employee of a company compared to being an entrepreneur. What really frightens me is some of the polling data I've seen from Greece or France, where most high school graduates, their highest aspiration is to get a government job. That, to me, is a horrible sign of degraded social capital.
Okay, any more?
Could I ask a slightly related question? I think one of the topics of the Free Market Roadshow is how we turn the crisis into an opportunity. And to do that, I think you need the idea that you can form the future, shape the future. And I feel sometimes there's a lack of faith in the future in Europe and in the Western world. Do you agree? How do we restore the faith in the future and in capitalism in that case?
Well, I've already said I'm very pessimistic because of all these demographics. but that being said, I think the world is a laboratory. And every time I debate one of my friends on the left, I always say, give me just one example of a country that became rich with statism. Or I even make it easier for them. If you can't do that, give me one example of a country that's growing faster than a similar country that has one country has bigger government than the other. Whereas if you ask the question of people like us, we have all sorts of case studies. So I think the empirical evidence is incredibly powerful for us, but then it gets back to some of what we talked about before, where if politically you can't get the elite to adopt these policies, then frankly it doesn't matter how much evidence is on our side. So I'm optimistic that the world is filled with evidence in favor of our position. I'm pessimistic about sometimes voters, but also the politicians to actually implementing the right changes.
I'm optimistic. You have to be, because if you're not, you're dead. And I think one of the key issues is I think that we are too well off. We're too comfortable. We are idle. And
but we could be even better off, perhaps.
We could be absolutely better off, but then the marginal benefit is not big enough. We're too well off. And as we see more growth in certain other parts, like in Asia, for example, we see less growth here. And either we start compete, we're better, or we're going to lose ground. It's as easy as that. And at some point, I think we will realize this, because now it's coming. It's coming out. People are employed. People don't get jobs. People are stay with their parents for ages. You know, it's not a living anymore. So I think the pressure is there. It's going to increase, I think.
I think we have to educate them, young people, also for the right kind of jobs. I think in Spain again, see the young people who I say, well, say to them, you know, learn good English and get decent math education, and you will have a job. I mean, for those who sit back and don't learn good English, and 40% are long-term unemployed. You know, so there are opportunities, but they just have to get up and go.
Well, people like Dan and I try to point out, did you know that average per capita GDP in Singapore is now twice that of France? And I remember when Singapore used to be a poor place. So there are these examples, these role models around the world. And it's not hopeless. I mean, Dan's pessimistic. It's easy to be pessimistic, but we also have the good examples, and some of us keep trying to point that out. And it's not hopeless.
No.
I mean, we can make the changes. And Sweden, in many ways, has been a good example, because you're, I still remember where you were 20 years ago in terms of the size of the government and your tax rates. And you did reverse course rather than go over the cliff like Greece.
We've done a tremendously good job in actually integrating all the immigrants. We've taken in 500,000 people in 8 years or something like that. And many of them jobs we have, in most countries in Europe, of the unemployed, half are long-term unemployed. In Sweden, we 19% are long-term unemployed of the unemployed group, so to say. And we have a overall low unemployment figure of around 8%. So it's if you really think of it, to turn the figures around, it's like a small miracle we've done here in taking in all these people. Where it will go from here on, it's hard to say, but that's.
Okay. Thank you. There are good role models, at least, to look at, and it's up to us to shape the future. Thank you so much for this discussion. Thank you.
I think there are some small gifts to speakers, and I also think I remember that we're talking about the role model from the beginning. Could be Switzerland, and there was actually one time when Swedish politicians went to Switzerland to learn something, and there was the exhaust emission regulation for cars in the 1980s. There was only 2 countries in the world who had the toughest regulation, and that was Switzerland and Sweden. And how did they do that? Because the Swedish EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, they like to go skiing. Yeah. So that could be the idea. So go to the mountains and find better roads than exhaust emissions regulations. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
I think